School safety, it's always on our minds, right? With everything going on, it's hard not to think about. So today we're going beyond the headlines, past the quick fixes and the alarmist claims, to really unpack what's happening in schools. And, honestly, more importantly, what we can learn from the data and expert analysis that's out there.
That's really the key here. It's about going beyond opinions and really digging into the numbers, the trends, putting things into historical context, too. That's how we get a clear picture of how school violence has shifted over time.
And hopefully figure out some truly effective solutions. It's not just about feeling safe.
Right. Everyone's impacted by this.
Exactly. It's about really understanding the nuances of what we're dealing with. And speaking of understanding, I got to say, I was kind of blown away by how much our current perception of school shootings is shaped by that one event, Columbine. So that's Cust's touchstone.
Yeah.
But the more I learn about it, the more I realize how much it skewed our perspective.
It's true. Columbine was horrific, no doubt. But it's had this outsized influence on how we think about these events. Like, people might be surprised to learn there were school shootings, multiple victims, well before Columbine.
Before Columbine? Really?
Yeah, like the Stockton shooting back in '89, 5 students killed, 32 injured. Or Jonesboro in '98, 5 students and a teacher. Just awful.
Wow. I mean, I know about those, but it's like Columbine became
The archetype.
Yeah. And I think the media had a lot to do with that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
All the talk about loners, trench coats, targeting athletes. So much of that turned out to be wrong.
Exactly. The media narrative really took hold. All that speculation, assumptions. It painted a picture that wasn't entirely accurate.
And that picture stuck with us.
Unfortunately, yeah. For example, the Columbine shooters, their main plan was actually a large-scale bombing.
Seriously.
The shooting, that was more a result of those bombs failing to go off as planned.
So the narrative we have, it's not even the whole story.
Right, and it makes you wonder if things had been reported differently back then, if we'd have approached school safety measures the same way.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And speaking of approaches to school safety, that kind of leads us to this whole rise of active shooter alarms. And I got to say, I'm starting to wonder if those things might be doing more harm than good.
It's a real concern. We trust fire alarms.
Right.
They have to meet national standards, rigorous testing, regulations.
Right, we know they're reliable.
But active shooter alarms, it's like the Wild West out there.
No kidding.
No national standards, no guarantees that the system will even work when it matters most. And we've seen what happens with all the false alarms going off. Imagine being a student, you're already on edge about this stuff, and then that alarm blares.
Oh, the trauma from that alone.
Yeah.
Especially if you've actually been through something like that.
It's asking for re-traumatization. There was that incident, I think it was at Oxford Middle School. The day after a memorial service for the victims of the Oxford High School shooting, a false alarm went off. The distress it caused, especially for those kids who are already grieving, just heartbreaking.
That's just awful.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are we even asking the right questions before we bring these technologies into schools? Are they effective, or are we just ticking a box without thinking about the consequences?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, we often don't think about those consequences until it's too late. And it feeds into this whole idea of, are we just trying to create these impenetrable fortresses? Are we really addressing the root causes, or are we just reacting?
Right. Are we actually making schools safer, or are we just making them feel more like prisons?
It's a tough question. And what we've seen over and over again is that most school shootings, they're not these meticulously planned Columbine-style attacks.
Yeah.
Not at all. They usually stem from personal conflicts, impulsive acts, situations that just escalate. And get this, did you know that about 70% of school shootings actually happen outside the school building?
Wait, outside? That doesn't make sense. I always think of classrooms hallways.
Right, that's because while the shooting might start outside, the victims often end up getting shot inside.
Oh, I see.
It's like outside you can scatter, right? Find cover, you can run, but inside there are only so many places to go.
So it's almost like we're funneling them into a more dangerous situation.
Exactly. So the question becomes, how do we design schools that are safer but don't feel like
prisons.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of data-driven design comes in. This expert, David Reedman, he actually created this database, the K-12 school shooting database, and he's a big advocate for using that data to actually inform how we build and design schools.
Data to guide our decisions instead of fear. I like that. So what's he suggesting?
Well, for one thing, he's not a fan of the whole fortress approach. He's more about creating open, adaptable spaces.
Interesting.
Like, instead of just hardening the perimeter, he talks about things like designing classrooms with multiple exits, almost like an airplane.
Multiple exit.
Yeah, so that if something happens, there's more than one way to get out quickly.
I mean, that sounds radical, but it makes sense. Having options in a crisis.
Exactly. He also talks about eliminating those big open areas like parking lots.
Parking lots are dangerous.
Well, they're often hot spots for violence. He suggests things like designated drop-off zones closer to the building, encourage walking and biking to school, reduce those potential conflict points.
It's about being smart with the design. It's not just about building walls. So what about technology? I mean, we've talked about the limitations of AI.
Right.
But are there ways to use it effectively to actually enhance safety?
Riedman believes there is, but it's got to be strategic. Like, he sees potential in using AI to monitor those less supervised areas, playgrounds, gyms, maybe even using it to detect early warning signs.
Early warning signs. Like what?
Well, he doesn't get too specific, but I imagine things like maybe unusual gatherings or sounds of aggression, stuff like that. He also talks about things like advanced sensors, like high-frequency radar.
To actually detect concealed weapons
Potentially, yeah.
instead of just metal detectors.
Right, because we know those aren't foolproof. But he's clear that this tech needs to be designed for schools, not just repurposed from airports or government buildings.
Makes sense?
And it has to be implemented thoughtfully. Privacy's huge. We don't want to turn schools into surveillance states.
Right. It's about finding that balance. Security without sacrificing.
The learning environment.
Exactly. You know, it's interesting. We talk about these things happening, and we always hear, he just snapped. You know, like there's this one single reason.
Oh, yeah.
But the research we looked at, it's rarely that simple, right?
Rarely. Riedman actually identifies 8 different archetypes of school shooters. And age, motivation, their connection to the school, even the type of weapon they use. It all paints a different picture.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's not just one profile fits all.
Definitely not. So, for example, there's this archetype he calls the adolescent insider.
Okay. That sounds familiar.
Right. This is typically a teenage boy, often dealing with bullying, maybe academic pressure, or some escalating conflict with another student.
This is more like a situation that just spirals.
Exactly. They're acting out of impulse, emotional distress. And the weapon's usually a handgun, which suggests it's less planned, more spontaneous.
Okay.
Then you've got the external threat. Someone with no real connection to the school. They might be involved in gang activity, illegal activities, or have a grudge against someone at the school.
Like those drive-by shootings you hear about.
Exactly. And their weapon's more likely to be a rifle or a shotgun, more firepower. And they tend to target those open areas we talked about, parking lots, the front of the school.
So understanding these different types of shooters, that could help schools develop more targeted security measures.
Absolutely. Like, if a school has a history of gang violence, you might focus on fortifying the perimeter, increase surveillance, have a more visible security presence.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about those cases where it's a former student who comes back?
That's another archetype. The disgruntled former student. Young adults still holding on to anger or resentment.
About something that happened at this school.
Exactly. They might target specific individuals or just lash out randomly. These attacks tend to be more planned, and they might use a handgun or a rifle. It's almost like they're trying to...
settle a score?
Yes. Make a statement.
Wow.
Then there's the reckless gun carrier.
Okay, what's that?
Often a student who brings a gun to school to show off, or they think they need it for protection, or they just don't understand how dangerous it is.
So it's more like a tragic accident waiting to happen.
Unfortunately. And these often happen in those less supervised areas we talked about. Playgrounds, locker rooms, even on school buses. It really highlights how important education is. Responsible gun ownership. That's a huge part of school safety.
Because sometimes the biggest danger isn't malice, it's ignorance. It makes you think about the emergency response, too. Like, if something does happen, how do we make sure we're doing everything we can to save lives?
It's the most important thing, and you're right, it often gets overlooked. And there's this fallacy, this dangerous assumption that's embedded in a lot of school shooting response plans, this idea of a second shooter.
Second shooter fallacy. What's that?
It's this belief that medical personnel, EMTs, paramedics, they should wait outside until the school is completely secured because there might be another shooter waiting to ambush them.
But that's incredibly rare, right?
Incredibly rare. Reedman's database. Out of 230 planned school attacks since 1966, only 7 involved multiple shooters, and none of them involved a second shooter targeting first responders.
But we've had hundreds of school shootings where victims are inside, they're bleeding, they're dying.
And they need help immediately. That delay, waiting for the all clear, it can be the difference between life and death.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this concept in the military, they call it the platinum 10 minutes. It's that critical window after a traumatic injury when getting medical treatment is essential.
Every minute counts.
Every second. We've seen cases where victims have bled to death while EMS is waiting outside for a second shooter that never materializes.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. We're so worried about the potential threat that we're forgetting about the victims who need help right now. So what do we do? How do we get medical personnel to the people who need them without putting them in danger?
Well, Reedman argues for a much more proactive approach. He suggests that police, EMS, they should enter the school immediately, even if there's still an active shooter.
Wow, that sounds incredibly risky.
It is. But as Reedman says, and I quote, "You risk a lot when you can save a lot."
That's powerful.
He stresses how important it is to train teachers and staff in basic first aid, how to apply a tourniquet, how to control bleeding.
Because in those first few minutes, they might be the only ones who can actually make a difference.
Exactly. They become the first line of defense. And it's not just about defending against the violence, it's about defending against further loss of life.
Exactly. Give them the tools and the knowledge to act, to potentially save lives in those crucial moments. And, it's interesting how we often gravitate towards these more dramatic solutions.
Oh, totally. Fortified buildings, all this high-tech security.
Right. But one of the simplest and arguably most effective ways to prevent school shootings is something we haven't even talked about.
And that is?
Safe gun storage.
Wow. You're totally right. It seems so obvious.
It really does.
But it's something you never really hear about.
It gets lost in the debate.
Yeah.
But if you look at the data, Reedman found that most of the guns used in school shootings, they're handguns.
Well, okay.
And those handguns, they're overwhelmingly obtained illegally by students.
Illegally, but...
often from their own homes.
So they're taking them from parents, relatives. It's a scary thought. It is. And it highlights this need for really strong, safe storage laws. I mean, we need to make it much harder for kids to even get their hands on these guns in the first place.
So what does a strong safe storage law even look like? I mean, is it as simple as just having a lock on a gun?
Reedman argues for a more, a multifaceted approach. He proposes this federal law that would require all guns to be stored unloaded.
Unloaded.
In a locked safe separate from ammunition.
Makes sense.
When not in use, obviously. And this is key. He also believes that gun owners should be held both criminally and civilly liable for any crimes committed with their unsecured firearms.
Yeah, okay. That would definitely make people think twice about, leaving a gun lying around.
Exactly.
But is legislation enough? I mean, we've seen it time and time again. We can make laws, but that doesn't necessarily change behavior.
You're absolutely right. It's just one piece of the puzzle. We need this cultural shift, too. We need to change how we view guns, how we talk about them, especially with young people.
So it's about more than just locking them up. It's about
normalizing responsible gun ownership. We need to teach kids about the very real dangers and emphasize that safe storage isn't just about protecting your guns. It's about protecting our children.
It's about this culture of responsibility. We all have a stake in this. Well, taking a step back, this whole deep dive has been a journey. We started with Columbine, this event that still has such a hold on how we see school shootings, even with all the, the inaccuracies.
Right.
We talked about the limits of technology, AI, gun violence at those Friday night football games, the need for better designs, better response plans. Honestly, it's been a lot, but also really eye-opening.
It is a lot to process. It's complex. No easy answers, right? But I think the big takeaway here is that there's no single solution.
Right.
It's got to be multifaceted, addressing the physical security of the schools and the social and cultural factors that lead to this violence.
We can't just react out of fear. We have to be proactive, challenge assumptions, embrace new ideas. After all this, I feel this renewed sense of urgency around this. This isn't just about data points. It's about real lives, real families.
It is.
Real communities forever changed by this violence. It's about creating a future where our kids can go to school, to a game, to the movies, and just know they're safe. And honestly, that's a future worth fighting for.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who wants to go deeper, I highly encourage you to check out David Reedman's website. Explore the data yourself, see how complex this issue really is. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand, the better equipped we are to make a difference.